The dust hung thick in the afternoon air of Red Bluff, Texas, like it had every day since the drought started in June. Thomas Wendell watched from his telegraph office window as the old man made his way across Main Street, the weathered oak cane tapping a steady rhythm against the hardpan earth. Each step looked like it cost James Colter something, his right leg dragging just slightly, the hip refusing to bend the way a man's hip ought to. Wendell had seen that walk for 22 years now, ever since Colter arrived in 1869 with enough cash to buy the old Hendricks place and enough silence to make folks stop asking questions after about a week. The three young men lounging outside the Cottonwood Saloon noticed him too. Pike Ketchum saw the limp first, and his face split into the kind of grin that made decent people cross the street. His two companions, both hired guns fresh from running a Morrison family off their homestead that morning, straightened up from where they'd been leaning against the hitching post. Wendell felt his stomach drop. He'd seen Pike kill 2 men in the past 3 months, both times over nothing more than wounded pride and whiskey courage. Well now, Pike called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Look at Grandpa shuffle. You need some help there, old-timer? Colter kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The cane tapped once, twice, 3 times. His face showed nothing, not anger, not fear, not even acknowledgement that he'd heard. Pike stepped off the boardwalk into Colter's path. I'm talking to you, cripple. The street went silent. Wendell counted maybe 20 people watching from windows and doorways, all of them frozen like rabbits that had just caught the scent of a wolf. Sarah Pritchard stood in the doorway of her general store, one hand pressed against the frame so hard her knuckles had gone white. In her other hand, hidden in the folds of her apron, Wendell could just make out the corner of something yellowed and old, paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times. Colter stopped. He looked at Pike with eyes that carried no heat, no challenge. Just a kind of patient waiting, like a man who'd seen this dance before and knew all the steps. That's better, Pike said. Now, seeing as how you're having such trouble getting around, maybe you ought to think about. He kicked the cane. The crack of oak against dirt sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Colter went down hard, his bad leg folding under him. He hit the street in a cloud of dust, and for just a moment, Wendell saw something flicker across the old man's face. Not pain, not humiliation, but something colder and more distant, like a door opening onto a room that had been locked for a very long time. Pike's companions howled with laughter. One of them slapped his knee. Pike stood over Colter, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, and Wendell noticed how careful he was to keep his hand away from his pistol. Even drunk and cruel, Pike Ketchum wasn't stupid enough to draw on a man already on the ground. That kind of thing could get you hanged, even in Texas. God help them, the bartender whispered from somewhere behind Wendell. They don't know. Wendell turned to see who'd spoken, but the bartender was already moving away, wiping down glasses with hands that shook slightly. At the far end of the bar, a stranger in a dusty coat had gone pale. He was staring at Colter's face with the kind of recognition that comes from wanted posters or campfire stories. As Wendell watched, the stranger carefully set down his whiskey, dropped a coin on the bar, and backed toward the door. He didn't turn his back on the street until he was outside, and then he walked very quickly toward the livery stable. Colter pushed himself up slowly. His hands went to the dirt first, then his good knee. The bad leg took longer, the hip joint refusing to cooperate until he shifted his weight just right. He retrieved his cane without looking at Pike, brushed the dust from his coat with slow, deliberate movements, and turned to continue across the street. You listening to me, old man? Pike called after him. You best not let me see you in town after sundown. You understand? Next time you won't get up. The laughter followed Colter all the way to the edge of town, to the small cabin that sat by itself near where the cottonwoods gave way to scrubland. He went inside and closed the door, and Wendell watched the window for a long time before he saw the shadow move across it. Colter reaching up, his arms stretching towards something mounted above the fireplace. Sarah Pritchard crossed the street then, moving quickly for a woman in her 60s. She came straight to Wendell's office and set the paper on his desk. It was a wanted poster printed in Kansas in 1867. The face was younger, the jaw harder, the eyes not yet marked by the weight of years. but it was unmistakably James Colter. The reward was $500 for information leading to his capture. The charges listed murder, 9 counts. They don't know what they just did, Sarah said quietly. Wendell looked at her, then at the poster, then back out the window toward Colter's cabin. Maybe it's been long enough that it doesn't matter. Maybe he really is just an old man now. Sarah shook her head. I was there, Tom. I saw what he was, and I saw what it cost him to become something else. She took the poster back, folded it carefully, and returned it to her apron. But some things don't leave a man just because he wants them to. Wendell had lived in Red Bluff for 30 years, and in that time, he'd learned that every town has its secrets. Some you talk about, and some you carry quiet until they're needed. James Colter was the kind of secret you hoped you'd never have to speak out loud. He arrived in the summer of 1869, riding a gray mare and leading a pack horse loaded with tools and supplies. He paid cash for the Hendricks place, 20 acres of scrubland with a creek that ran most of the year and enough grass to support horses. He built corrals and a small barn, and within a month, he was breaking horses for the local ranchers. He was good at it, patient and methodical, and he never asked for more than fair pay. He attended Sunday services at the Baptist church, always sitting in the back row. He helped Mrs. Henderson and the other widows with their firewood each winter, showing up early on cold mornings and splitting wood until their sheds were full. He never drank, never gambled, never raised his voice. The limp was always there, pronounced enough that folks assumed he'd taken a bullet during the war, cavalry maybe, or infantry at Shiloh or Antietam. Most figured him for a man who'd seen enough violence and wanted nothing more than to live quiet. They were right about that. They just didn't know how much violence it had taken to teach him that lesson. The Ketchum gang had been terrorizing Red Bluff for 3 months now. They'd started small, buying up land from farmers who couldn't make their mortgages, always offering just enough to make leaving seem reasonable. But when the Morrison family refused to sell, for riders had burned their hay barn and shot their mill cow. The Morrisons were on the afternoon stage to Kansas City by the time the ashes cooled. The marshal had ridden out to confront them 6 weeks ago. His horse came back 3 days later with an empty saddle and blood on the reins. Nobody had seen Marshal Guthrie since. Pike Ketchum was the nephew of Ezra Ketchum, who ran the operation from a ranch house 10 miles east. Ezra had railroad money behind him, a consortium out of Chicago that wanted the land for a new trunk line south to Mexico. What they wanted, they generally got, and Ezra Ketchum was the kind of man who didn't mind doing the getting. Sarah Pritchard knew more than most about James Colter's past because she'd been there when it happened. She was 17 in 1867, working in her father's general store in Cimarron Creek, Kansas. The Dalton Reeves gang had taken over the town that spring. 9 men who'd started as Confederate raiders during the war and decided peacetime offered better opportunities. They'd extorted the merchants, assaulted the women, and shot anyone who objected. The territorial marshal said Cimarron Creek was beyond his jurisdiction. The county sheriff said he didn't have the deputies to spare. So the town pooled their money and sent for James Colter. He was 28 then, already legendary in 3 territories for cleaning out places where law wouldn't go. The story said he'd never drawn first, never missed, and never killed a man who wasn't trying to kill him. He charged $1,000 plus expenses, and he always worked alone. He arrived on a Tuesday and spent 2 days just watching. Sarah remembered seeing him in her father's store, buying tobacco and coffee, his eyes moving constantly over the street outside. He asked quiet questions: who went where, when they moved, how they positioned themselves. He bought a notebook and filled it with sketches and observations. On Thursday, 3 of the gang died behind the livery stable. Colter had chosen the terrain carefully, a narrow space between buildings where numbers didn't matter, where 3 men had to come at him in a line. They tried to ambush him at dawn. He'd been waiting. On Friday, 2 more fell when they attempted to reverse the trap. They'd hidden in the hayloft of the stable, planning to shoot Colter when he came looking for his horse. He'd burned them out with a torch and shot them as they jumped. Sarah's father had watched from across the street and said Colter's face showed less emotion than a man chopping wood. Saturday at high noon, the final 4 walked into the street. Tom and Jack Dalton, William Reeves, and a gunman named Carson who was supposed to be the fastest draw in Kansas. Sarah watched from her father's store window, her younger sister pressed against her side. Her sister was 13, and 2 weeks earlier, Jack Dalton had cornered her in the alley behind the church. Colter walked straight at them. No cover, no tactics, just a direct approach that dared them to break first. They did. All four drew, and Colter's gun came out like it was spring-loaded. Tom Dalton went down first, then Carson, then Reeves. Jack Dalton got a shot off. The bullet caught Colter in the hip and spun him sideways. He didn't fall. His fourth shot hit Jack Dalton in the chest, and the last of the gang collapsed in the street. Only then did Colter go down, his leg no longer supporting his weight. The town doctor, Sarah's uncle, worked on him for 6 hours. He saved Colter's life, but couldn't save the hip. The joint was shattered, pieces of bone driven into muscle and cartilage. The knee had taken secondary damage from the impact. The doctor told Colter he'd walk again, but he'd never run, never ride properly, and he'd certainly never outdraw anyone. The surviving gang members, 2 who'd been out of town that week, posted a bounty. $500 for James Colter, dead or alive, for the murder of their brothers. It didn't matter that Cimarron Creek saw it as justice. Blood called for blood, and bounty hunters didn't care much about the difference. Colter disappeared the next morning. Sarah's sister had wanted to thank him, but he was already gone. They found $1,000 in gold left on the doctor's desk, along with a note that said simply, "For the trouble." That was 1867. Now it was 1891, and the man who'd cleaned out Cimarron Creek in 6 days was being laughed at in the street by boys who'd barely learned to shave. The morning after Pike kicked the cane, for riders burned Colter's barn. Wendell heard about it from Dutch Kerrigan, who'd been hauling freight through before dawn and seen the smoke. By the time Wendell reached Colter's property, the structure was fully engulfed, black smoke rolling up against the pink sunrise. Colter was in the dirt 20 yards away, his bad leg twisted under him, his hands clawed into fists. 3 horses were screaming inside the barn. The 4 riders sat their mounts in a loose semicircle, watching. Pike Ketchum held a piece of paper in his hand, laughing as Colter tried to get his leg under him and failed. "You want to save them horses, old man?" Pike called. "Better hurry up." Colter made it to his knees before the leg gave out again. The hip simply wouldn't bear weight, not when he needed it to move fast, not when panic overrode the careful management of his injury. He went down face first, and the sound that came from the barn drove spikes into Wendell's chest. The horses died while Colter lay in the dirt, and Pike Ketchum laughed. When the screaming finally stopped, Pike rode over and nailed the paper to Colter's cabin door. Then the 4 riders left at a walk, relaxed and easy, men who knew they'd face no consequences. Colter eventually got himself upright using the cane. He read the notice. Then he limped to his porch and sat down in the chair there. And he didn't move for 3 hours. Wendell watched from a distance, wanting to help, but knowing there was nothing he could offer that would matter. The notice gave Colter until noon Friday to vacate the property. 3 days. It was signed by Ezra Ketchum and bore the seal of the Transcontinental Railroad Consortium. Legal, official, and backed by men with enough money to make the law look the other way. Sarah arrived around midday with food Colter wouldn't eat and information that changed everything. "There are more coming," she said, sitting across from Colter on his porch. Ezra called in reinforcements. 8 more men on Friday morning's train. That makes 15 total. Colter looked at her with those patient eyes. "You telling me to run?" "I'm telling you the odds. Odds don't change what's right." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping. "If you run, who burns next? The Morrison place is already gone. Mine is worth something to the railroad. So is Dutch's freight yard. So is Hewitt's family farm north of town. That's not my weight to carry. Isn't it?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "You carried it before. That's why my sister can sleep without nightmares. That's why Cimarron Creek is still standing." Colter was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That was before." "Before what?" He gestured at his leg. "Before this. Before I got slow. Before getting out of a chair took planning." Sarah reached in her apron and pulled out the wanted poster. She unfolded it on the small table between them. Ezra Ketchum, is Tom Dalton's cousin. Did you know that? Colter's face didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes. A door closing, a decision made. He knows who you are, Sarah continued. This whole thing, the land grab, the railroad consortium, all of it, it's real enough. But you specifically, your 20 acres specifically, that's personal. He's been waiting 24 years to pay you back for Tom Dalton. Then he's patient. He's also brought 15 men to make sure you die humiliated and helpless. Colter picked up the poster, studied his younger face. Might be I deserve it. For what? Saving my sister? Saving the town? For thinking I could stop violence with more violence. For thinking there was a clean way to do it. He set the poster down. Every man I killed had brothers, cousins, someone who remembers. It never ends, Sarah. It just moves. So you let move here? Let it burn out the people who've been your neighbors for 20 years. That hung in the air between them. Finally, Colter said, I'm not who I was. This leg won't let me be. Sarah stood to leave. At the door she paused. My uncle said you'd never outdraw anyone again. He didn't say you'd lost your mind. He didn't say you'd forgotten how to think. After she left, Colter sat alone until the sun began its descent. Then he stood, using the cane, and walked slowly around his property. He wasn't just walking, though. He was studying angles, sight lines, cover points. His hand went to his coat pocket and came out with a small leather notebook, old and worn. He opened it and began sketching, his hands moving with the kind of precision that muscle memory provides even when the joints ache. That afternoon, Pike, Ketchum, and 2 riders came into town and made their announcement at the Cottonwood Saloon. Every man, woman, and child who helped James Colter would share his fate. The deadline was Friday noon. Anyone still on Colter's property after that would be considered hostile. The town council met that evening and posted their own notice. For the public good and the prevention of violence, Mr. James Colter is respectfully requested to comply with a lawful eviction order. Wendell watched from his office as the sun set, as lamps came on in windows, as Red Bluff settled into another night of fear and shame. He thought about packing up, leaving before Friday came. He thought about it hard. The knock on Colter's door came well after dark. Deputy Marshal Hewitt stood there, hat in his hands, looking about 12 years old despite being 23. He had his badge pinned to his shirt and a Winchester rifle over his shoulder. I want to help, Hewitt said. Colter studied him from the doorway. You ever kill a man? No, sir. Want to? No, sir. But I won't let them burn this town one family at a time. Colter leaned on his cane, considering. How many people in Red Bluff you figure are worth dying for? Hewitt didn't hesitate. All of them, if it means they stop living like this. Something in Colter's face shifted then, not softening exactly, but acknowledging. Go home, deputy. This isn't your fight. Whose is it? Mine. Has been since 1867. But as Hewitt turned to leave, Colter called him back. One question. If I needed 4 people who could shoot straight and wouldn't run, could you find them? Yes, sir. Not asking you to kill anyone. Just asking if you could follow orders and trust me when nothing makes sense. What are you planning? To make sure 15 becomes 0 without firing unless I have to. Hewitt looked at him for a long moment. The reinforcements aren't coming Friday morning, Mr. Colter. They're already here. Camped at Blackstone Creek since Tuesday, waiting for Ezra's signal. Colter absorbed this without visible reaction. How many total? 23 that I counted. And you waited until now to tell me? Had to be sure I was willing to stand with you first. Figured that information might get me killed if the wrong people knew I had it. Colter nodded slowly. The 4 people. Tomorrow night. And deputy? Bring that Winchester. After Hewitt left, Colter went to the floorboards near his bed and pried one up. From the space beneath, he withdrew a small wooden box, locked. The key hung on a cord around his neck, hidden under his shirt. Inside the box was a second revolver, twin to the one he'd cleaned the night before, and beneath that his tactical notebook from the years 1863 to 1868. He opened the notebook and began to read his own notes from Cimarron Creek. Positions, angles, timing. How to force 9 men into situations where numbers meant nothing. How to use terrain, light psychology. How to win when your body wouldn't let you be fast. The entries were detailed, methodical. This wasn't the work of a gifted gunfighter. This was the work of a tactician, a man who studied war the way others studied scripture. At the bottom of the final page, in his own hand from 24 years ago, he'd written, "Speed matters less than position. Fast only matters if you're in the wrong place. Be in the right place, and fast enough is plenty." He closed the book and looked at his hands. They shook slightly, age and arthritis and old wounds. But they still remembered. That was something. Thursday night, 5 people gathered in Colter's cabin. Deputy Hewitt brought Samuel Gray, who ran the hardware store but had been a Union sharpshooter during the war. Dutch Kerrigan, the freight hauler, who'd learned to shoot defending wagon trains on the Santa Fe Trail. And Maria Cortez, whose husband Pike Ketchum had killed 2 months ago over a land dispute. Maria had 3 children and a rifle she'd been using since she was 10 years old. Colter spread a map on his table, hand-drawn, detailed, showing Blackstone Creek and the approaches to Red Bluff. He'd walked it that afternoon despite the pain in his leg, verifying what he'd remembered and updating what had changed. "We're not fighting 23 men," he said without preamble. "We're removing their advantages before the fight starts." He laid it out with military precision. The gang's camp was in a draw with poor sight lines. 2 exit routes, both narrow. Samuel and Dutch would take positions on the ridges at 4 a.m., before first light, with overlapping fields of fire. Maria and Hewitt would scatter the horses using firecrackers Dutch had in his freight yard, loud enough to stampede, safe enough not to hurt the animals. "And you?" Samuel asked. "I walk into their camp at dawn and give Ezra a choice. They'll kill you. Not if they're smart. By then their horses will be gone, their exits covered, and they'll be deciding whether pride is worth dying for." Colter looked at each of them in turn. "I need to be honest. My leg will fail if I have to move fast. I can't outdraw a man who's ready for me. If this goes wrong, we probably all die." "Then why are we doing it?" Maria asked. "Because running just moves the problem. It'll be your family next, or Samuel's business, or Dutch's freight yard. Ezra's not leaving until he gets what he came for." Colter paused. "I already ran once. It didn't solve anything. Just gave evil time to catch up. They began at 3:30 Friday morning, 8 hours before the noon deadline." Samuel and Dutch moved through pre-dawn darkness to reach the ridges overlooking Blackstone Creek. The camp was easy to find. Cook fires still smoldering, 23 bedrolls arranged around them. The guards were lazy, confident. Why wouldn't they be? They had overwhelming numbers and a crippled old man to terrorize. Samuel positioned himself 400 yards north with his Sharps rifle and Hewitt's Winchester. Dutch took the south ridge with his hunting rifle and a clear view of both exits. They settled in to wait, the cold seeping into their bones, stars still bright overhead. At 4:45, Maria and Hewitt reached the horse camp. 19 animals on a picket line a quarter mile from where the men slept. Maria cut the line while Hewitt placed Dutch's firecrackers in a line downwind. When they lit, the string of explosions sounded like a firefight. The horses bolted as one, thundering into the hills, and by the time the gang woke and realized what was happening, the animals were scattered across 3 miles of rough country. At 5:15, as the first pink light touched the eastern sky, James Colter walked into Ezra Ketchum's camp. He used his cane, moving slowly and deliberately. He was utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. 23 men woke to find a crippled old man standing in the middle of their camp. Pike Ketchum came up with his gun half drawn before Ezra's voice cut across the morning air. "Hold!" Ezra Ketchum was 45, hard-eyed, and smart enough to survive 2 decades of killing. He stood from his bedroll and walked toward Colter, taking in the cane, the limp, the age. His face showed recognition and confusion. "James Colter," Ezra said. "Heard you were faster." "Was. 24 years ago. Then what the hell are you doing here?" Colter planted his cane and met Ezra's eyes. "Giving you a choice. 1 hour to gather your men and walk back to the railroad. Leave Red Bluff, leave the land grab, and this ends without blood." The camp erupted in laughter. Pike stepped forward, grinning. "Old man, are you touched in the head? Look around. You're one cripple with a walking stick, and we're 23 men who just lost their horses, Colter interrupted. In a camp with 2 exits, both covered by rifles you can't see. With men who've decided you're not leaving here unless I let you. The laughter died. Ezra's face changed as the implications hit him. He looked toward where the horses should have been, then toward the ridges. You're bluffing. Colter just waited. Ezra calculated. Tested or fold. Pride or survival. He looked at his nephew, at the men around him, at 24 years of waiting for this moment. Take him, he said. Alive. Pike and 2 others rushed Colter. The old man dropped his cane, and his left hand, the one that didn't shake quite as badly, blurred toward his hip. The draw wasn't as fast as it had been in 1867, but it was faster than Pike Ketchum's. The shot hit Pike in the shoulder before he cleared leather, spinning him sideways. The boom of Samuel Sharp's rifle echoed across the draw, a heavy round plowing into the dirt between the other 2 rushers. They froze, hands still reaching for guns they hadn't drawn. Already gone. Maria's voice carried from the southern ridge, answering Ezra's screamed order to reach the horses. The camp dissolved into chaos. Men grabbed for weapons. Samuel and Dutch fired 3 more precision shots. Dirt explosions, warning shots, perfect demonstration of control. 2 gang members dropped their guns immediately and raised their hands. Colter stood in the center of it all, revolver steady despite the shaking, and didn't fire again. He didn't need to. Ezra Ketchum was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He just watched a crippled old man outmaneuver his entire operation using 4 townspeople and a pair of rifles. His horses were scattered, his exits covered, and the railroad consortium wouldn't pay him for dead gunmen. Stand down, Ezra ordered. The camp went still. Colter's voice carried clearly in the silence. Sundown. Be gone from Red Bluff territory by sundown. Ezra stepped close enough to speak quietly. Tom Dalton was my cousin. I've waited 24 years for this. I've been easy to find for 24 years, Colter replied. You knew where I was. You came with 23 men because you knew one wasn't enough. Something flickered in Ezra's eyes. Rage, respect, the knowledge that he'd been outplayed. If I see you anywhere in Texas after this, I'll come personally. I'll be right where I've always been. The gang left on foot, carrying Pike and their gear, walking back toward the railroad. Samuel, Dutch, Maria, and Hewitt descended from the ridges to find Colter sitting on a rock, revolver still in his left hand, cane gripped in his right. His leg had finally given out the moment the adrenaline faded. Is it over? Hewitt asked. Colter looked toward Red Bluff, smoke from morning cook fires rising into the dawn. For them, yes. For me, it was over at Cimarron Creek. This was just making sure someone else didn't pay my debts. By Friday afternoon, word had spread. The town didn't celebrate. They were too stunned, too ashamed of their own fear. Wendell watched as people began gathering at Colter's burned property with lumber and tools. Samuel, Dutch, Maria, a dozen others. They rebuilt the barn through the weekend, working in quiet determination. Colter didn't help. His leg was swollen to twice its normal size, infected from strain. The doctor came, changed the dressing, and told Wendell privately that Colter had maybe 2 years of mobility left before he'd be chairbound. The cost of Cimarron Creek and Blackstone Creek was coming due. Deputy Hewitt received the official marshal's badge from the territorial office on Monday. Red Bluff had law again, and Hewitt wore it with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been tested and hadn't broken. Sarah Pritchard took the wanted poster from her drawer and fed it to her stove. She watched it burn to ash and felt 24 years of debt finally settle. Sunday morning, Colter attended church as usual, sitting in the back row. The sermon was about courage and sacrifice, though Reverend Mitchell was careful not to name anyone specifically. After the service, a young boy approached Colter in the churchyard. Mister, is it true you faced down 23 bad men with just a cane? Colter looked at the boy for a long moment, at the eager face and wide eyes. I had help, and the cane's just for walking. The boy ran off to tell his friends, and Colter stood slowly, the cane taking his full weight. Wendell walked alongside him toward Colter's property, toward the new barn that stood where ashes had been. You did a good thing, Wendell said. Did a necessary thing. Good might be overstating it. They walked in silence for a while, the cane tapping its steady rhythm. Finally, Wendell asked what he'd been wondering all week. Was it worth it, knowing what it's going to cost you? Colter considered that. Legends are built on the moments when ordinary men decide fear matters less than what's right. I'm not special, Tom. I just had skills that let me act when others couldn't. And when Red Bluff needed those skills one more time, I couldn't very well claim they belonged to someone else. He paused at his property line, looking at the new barn at the town beyond. The poster's ash. The gang scattered. The town's safe. And I'm walking toward the end that violence always promised me. That's not tragedy. That's the bargain legends make. Wendell watched him continue alone toward the barn, each step measured and deliberate. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The sound of the cane on packed earth was steady as a heartbeat. Some men age into weakness. Others just let the world forget what they were. James Colter never forgot. And when Red Bluff needed him to remember, he paid the price one last time.